Sound matters. Be heard. Welcome to the podcast where you get exclusive behind-the-scenes tips to make your own show sound truly spectacular. This is Podtastic Audio.
Hey, what's happening? How are you doing today? I want to say thank you. Yeah, I truly do mean thank you so much for being here today. I really appreciate you giving me your time to listen to this podcast episode, which I do create for you. I am Chris, and I am from the original Chris and Christine Show podcast. You can find out every single thing about that show on a website, which I built all by myself. Yeah, check that out at chrisandchristineshow.com. And there's a link to it in the show notes of this episode. Go ahead and check that out. If you want to, go right ahead. But today on Podtastic Audio, we're going to talk about a few things that help you continue to make an amazing podcast and what your audience truly deserves and what you should be delivering to your audience for every episode. Now, however you decide to create your podcast episodes, you are the captain of your podcast ship, and you can create your episode however you want to do it. Don't let me or anybody else tell you exactly how you need to do your own podcast. It's your show. You're in charge of your own destiny. And that's kind of the beauty of us independent podcasters, is because we do not work for a company. We do not have an overhead or perhaps a boss or a manager telling us exactly, well, you got to talk about these things and these things only. You got to do it just like this. And you only have 30 minutes to do it and get to it. And you only interview this person or that person. No, we are independent here. We can do whatever we want. We can decide to do a weekly show, or we can decide to do a monthly show, or we can just do any combination of anything we want. It's really up to us. But there's two key things I think every podcaster really should have when they create a podcast. One, obviously, good audio quality. That's a no-brainer. You really want your listeners to really hear and clearly understand the things that you're talking about without having any distraction to the audio. That's basically what it is. Make your audio good enough to where it's not distracting, so the listener is really focusing on that dog barking, or they're focusing on that hum, or they're focusing on the fact that your co-host is at a volume 2 and you're on a volume 10. Balance it out. Figure that stuff out. If you need help, I'll hook you up. That's what the show is all about. But on the second part of that is you really have to have engaging and compelling content, something that you really cannot get anywhere else. And I know that's hard to really do, is to deliver content that's not been either said before or viewed before on YouTube or something along those lines. But however you create your podcast, just always remember to always have fun and make it a great time and a great experience for your audience. Your audience should really come first. They should be priority number one. What do they want to hear, and how does it sound on their end? What is the end user experience? One of my favorite heroes of all time, I would say, is probably Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs actually was the co-founder and creator of Apple Computers, which if you've been living under a rock, Apple Computers is probably one of the biggest, if not the biggest, computer company in the world. I own an iMac. I bought an iMac, but I actually have a MacBook computer. I have iPhone, although I do not have an iPad. I've been using a Google tablet for many years. I've been sticking with that. But I do know that I do like the Apple products a little better. And they're a little more of a premium product, I would say. They work very well. They're very rugged. This is not an Apple commercial of any kind, but I just love their stuff. And many years ago, Apple was not as popular as they are today. They were like a lower rung company, and they were almost, I think they either went into bankruptcy or they're about to go into bankruptcy in the early 90s. I remember I used to go to a computer store back in the early 90s, and you see all these IBM computers, either IBM computer or they'd have like these IBM clone computers. And a lot of them had all these, of course, Windows software, of course, but a lot of the software for sale was all like Windows-based software. And you might find a small, tiny little section, maybe like one or two little things for sale for Apple. There wasn't a lot to choose from. So Windows and Windows, this was when Microsoft really kind of took off with Windows 3.1, and then they had, I think, Windows 95 and then 2000, all that great stuff. It kind of really exploded to the scene with the Windows computers. Now, I've owned both. The Apple one seems to work better for me, and they've kind of come down in price a little bit. They're not as expensive as they once were. I remember years ago. But if you know the brief story of Steve Jobs, how he started Apple, had this computer company going, but through some decisions and through a difference of ideas with the board members of Apple, he was kind of shoved out of Apple. Here you start this company, and you're the king of the company, and then you get pushed out, and then you got to figure out what you're going to do next. And that's exactly what he started. He started his company Next, and I guess he did that for a little while, and then eventually he ends up back working for Apple, and it becomes the man in charge, and he is going to take the company in a new direction, because during those years, Apple really started tanking, and they were looking like they were going to go under. So they bring Steve Jobs back, and they say, hey, help us out. Let's figure this thing out. Let's make a new direction for the company. And he had these great, wonderful ideas to bring the company back from the dead, pretty much. And he was at a conference where he was giving a presentation on perhaps maybe the new directions he was going to take the company and what he's planning on doing. So I have a clip of one of those conferences. This happened sometime around 1996, 1997, just before they announced the brand new iMac computer, which pretty much rechanged the entire company, and everybody started becoming all in on Apple. Then kind of probably the iMac probably was the catalyst to kind of launch them into kind of the company they are today. All started from that moment. But here at the conference, there was, usually most conferences, they have like a Q&A section for members of the crowd or media would ask questions. And one of the members of the media asked a really hard question to Steve Jobs. He basically almost kind of insulted him with the question. And I'm going to play that for you, and you're going to hear what Steve says in his response to this knucklehead when he asks this very difficult question. Here, take a listen.
It's sad and clear that on several counts you've discussed, you don't know what you're talking about. I would like, for example, for you to express in clear terms how, say, Java, in any of its incarnations, addresses the ideas embodied in OpenDoc. And when you're finished with that, perhaps you could tell us what you personally have been doing for the last 7 years.
One of the hardest things when you're trying to affect change is that people like this gentleman are right in some areas. I'm sure that there are some things OpenDoc does, probably even more that I'm not familiar with, that nothing else out there does. And I'm sure that you can make some demos, maybe a small commercial app that demonstrates those things. The hardest thing is, how does that fit in to a cohesive, larger vision that's going to allow you to sell $8 billion, $10 billion of product a year? And one of the things I've always found is that you've got to start with the customer experience and work backwards to the technology. You can't start with the technology and try to figure out where you're going to try to sell it. And I've made this mistake probably more than anybody else in this room. And I've got the scar tissue to prove it. And I know that it's the case. And as we have tried to come up with a strategy and a vision for Apple, it started with what incredible benefits can we give to the customer? Where can we take the customer? Not starting with, let's sit down with the engineers and figure out what awesome technology we have, and then how are we going to market that? And I think that's the right path to take.
So what Steve is basically saying is that the end user you really need to put focus on how they experience the product. And when it comes to your podcast, think of what does the end user take away from listening and experiencing your podcast? What do they get out of it? It's like you create this podcast so you can bring value to your audience so they can do blank. Whatever it is, it's up to you. It's your show. So today I have 7 ways that you can prioritize delivering value to your podcast audience, because value should be a main, if not the main priority every time you put anything on the screen or record anything into a microphone. You should prioritize the actual value of what the audience is going to expect and what the audience is going to get from listening to your podcast. So the first way to prioritize delivering value is have a clear audience understanding. Basically, you want to invest time in understanding what your audience or your core target audience really needs and what they need to listen to. What are their preferences? Basically, you want to deliver content that resonates with your specific demographic, whoever that is. It's basically going to, who is this for? And the second thing I have is you want to educate and inform. You want to be able to bring educational content that provides actionable takeaways that will leave the audience with a new skill set, or perhaps maybe knowing something that they can say, hey, you know what? I heard this on a podcast. You know, that famous phrase, I heard this on a podcast. Perhaps that podcast they're referring to could be yours. So moving on to number 3. Number 3 is solve problems. This is where if you identify the common problems that your particular audience has within your niche, you can address them on your podcast. You can say, oh, you're having a problem with this? Well, here is the solution. That is a definite way to bring value to your audience. Now, moving on to number 4. Number 4 is this. You want to entertain and engage. You see, your podcast can't just be information for information's sake. You have to have a little entertainment. Use some storytelling, perhaps some humor, maybe tell some jokes, maybe be real, be honest. It's your show, do it how you like, but your show is not going to survive on strictly only information. You have to have a personality to go with it. That's why podcasting is so great, because we can hone on both at the same time. So moving on to number 5. Number 5 is this. You want consistency and reliability. Now, this goes to having a core value of understanding what your podcast is about, deliver on that promise in a consistent way, and of course, also make it sure it sounds great and looks great every single episode. You want to be able to be consistent. If you are consistent with the same content and the same values every single episode, and you deliver as promised, it's always on time, just like you are, that is a surefire way to deliver value to your audience. And moving on to number 6. Number 6 is interact and listen. Now, this is where you actually can have listener feedback via social media posts, or perhaps maybe an old-fashioned email that someone writes into you. I appreciate you guys writing into me. I do love that. I do appreciate that stuff, whether it's on social media, emails, however you take that response, listen to that stuff and actually adapt your podcast accordingly. If, say, your listeners are really concerned about X, Y, or Z, then address X, Y, or Z on your podcast. You're building the show for them. They will appreciate you doing that, and it does deliver a tremendous amount of value because it pinpoints exactly what they said, the concerns they might have. Like, talk about this, please, and you do talk about that on your show. Then the audience is going to be more loyal, and they're going to appreciate you doing that. And the 7th way to deliver value to your podcast audience is to continually improve your podcast. You always can be improving your show. Don't think, I've already said it, it's this way, and this is the only way the show is going to be forever, and I'm just going to keep it the same way. And that's just the way it is. You should always be looking for ways to actually improve your show and make it better. Everybody, every show, any show out there has always got room for improvement. They always can improve a few things, and don't be afraid to try new things. Look at your podcast performance. Maybe one particular episode is doing better than other episodes. Maybe you mentioned one thing on that show that's doing better than another show. Maybe you might realize that I'm doing the video show on YouTube and I'm doing the regular audio podcast show. And you might be surprised to find out that you may be getting more audio downloads on the audio version than on the actual YouTube version. So it begs the question is, why would you focus so much time and energy on a YouTube version of the same content? I would focus on the audio version first, then throw the YouTube version up there on YouTube, of course, to get traction and get eyeballs and discoverability. Yeah, that's great. But focus mostly on creating an amazing audio podcast. Remember that the value that you deliver to your audience is not limited to just the content itself. It also can have the experience of being part of your podcast community. If you build a strong connection with your audience, offer consistent value, and you're always adapting to the changes and needs that they need to hear. And maybe they write back to you and say, can you talk about this or that? And you're always adapting to those things and always evolving. And the most important thing I would say is probably always listen to what your audience really needs to hear. Remember, you are doing the show for them. It's your show, I know, but you're really doing it for them, the listener. What does the listener hear on the back end when it's all said and done, when they press play on whichever app they like to use? How does it sound, and does it deliver any kind of value, and what do they get out of that show? One thing always comes to mind when I see a lot of the podcasts that I would say are usually, they're okay. They're just a lot of the same thing. When you see a lot of the basic Zoom interview shows that are out there, whether it's in the business space or teaching space or self-help space, a lot of the businesses, they default to this whole Zoom recording show, probably because it's what they know. They use Zoom for their business and things like that, or Teams meetings or whatever, and they treat it like a Teams call or a Teams meeting. But it got me scratching my head thinking, how are those shows any different than all the million other shows out there? It's like the YouTuber on YouTube is trying to compete with all of the millions of other, or I'd say even billions of other YouTube shows out there. YouTube is great. Don't get me wrong. I love YouTube. But if you're going to try to stand out in YouTube, remember, you are a speck of sand on the beach compared to all the millions, maybe even billions of other shows that are out there. You got to find out a way to make your show better than all the rest. And it cannot be merely just information. You have to deliver amazing value that the listener, the audience, really wants to come to you for your great wisdom, for your great expertise, your superpower. It made me think about this yesterday. The biggest comic book hero of probably all time and all the comic book world universe is probably Superman, right? He flies, he can shoot lasers out of his eyes, he's super strong, he's like made out of steel or something, whatever he is. But everybody loves Superman. He's probably the most notorious, most famous, most popular superhero of all the superheroes. Everybody loves Superman. And when you go to a Superman movie, you want to see him flying, fighting crime, and doing all those cool, crazy things, right? But when he's not Superman, he puts on a pair of glasses, wears a suit, and he becomes Clark Kent, just a regular, normal guy that's working at the newspaper, the Daily Planet. He's just fitting in the background, just kind of blending in. He's Mr. Nobody. Now, of the two, which one of them would you pay a ticket to the movies to go see? Would you go see a movie about Clark Kent that was titled Superman? Or would you go to the movies and pay to see Superman do all the cool Superman stuff? You pay to see Superman. Nobody pays to see Clark Kent. So make sure your podcast is the Superman version of all the other boring podcasts out there. Don't be Clark Kent. Don't just blend in and fit in. You have a superpower. Use it. Hey, thank you once again for listening to this episode today. You know what every single podcaster really needs, other than a microphone, of course? Yeah, it's probably a website. My website is podtasticaudio.com. Very simple. Go on ahead and check that out. I got all kinds of past episodes over there, information, a way to contact me, and I will catch you on the next episode.